Afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and welcome to today's webinar, which is an update for 2021 on the work of our Supply Chain Committee. So we've just actually come out of a webinar hosted by Westchester Publishing Services and moderated by Jim Milliot, managing editor of Publishers Weekly, on the current issues within the supply chain, and you may have some questions about that. We certainly would encourage you to ask, but our focus today is going to be largely on an update to the work that we've been doing throughout 2021 in the area of supply chain. Before I start, I just wanted to give everyone here an overview of what BISG is trying to do in broader terms. Our mission is to create a more informed, empowered, and efficient book industry, and there are a lot of different ways that we try to do that. In particular, on the far right, the objectives that we have for this organization consist of 4 different priorities. The first is to establish BISG as an information hub. In the area of standards, we try to foster the use of standards that improve revenue, that promote product visibility, reduce costs, and ensure transparency across the supply chain. We conduct research, ideally about emerging topics, issues, and trends, and we do so in a way that tries to shape the conversation that occurs on our board and in our committees, as well as within the industry, about both the current state and the future of book publishing. And then the last piece, we foster diversity, equity, and inclusion both within BISG and ideally across all segments of the book publishing industry supply chain. When these pieces all fit together and work, they create a bit of a virtuous circle, each piece reinforcing those around it. That's kind of our goal. It works pretty well, particularly as you'll hear about today in our committee cycle. Our goals ultimately benefit the industry because they solve problems that increase costs, lower revenues, or block the development of new models. We try to ensure transparent information that can shape decisions. We're always working to improve both the timeliness and the accuracy of supply chain data, both provided by the supply chain and derived in some way. And we try to give all of our members a voice in setting standards and best practices. We do this in a variety of ways, but probably the most important piece of the puzzle is our committee structure. We have 5 standing committees. These are shown in the green circles at the bottom. They include the supply chain, but also metadata and identification, rights, subject codes, which is the committee that is responsible for managing BISAC, and workflow. So we take a variety of different topics and then assign them either to a committee or an ad hoc working group to both quantify and come up with solutions to make things work better. Overall, members of BISG benefit in a variety of different ways. The first piece, they support the industry through membership, sponsorship, and research. We provide access to information that improves how our members operate. That's through membership, attendance at events, and participation in events and other activities. And the last piece, and probably the most important, is that foundational shaping the ongoing conversation about book publishing. We try to give all of our members an opportunity to have a voice in where the industry is going. And this is done most substantially through our committees. As I mentioned a moment ago, we have 5 standing. These are all staffed and led by member volunteers, including committee chairs who dedicate significant time and thinking throughout the year to advance the agenda. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk specifically about the Supply Chain Committee. Just for reference, earlier this year, we've already given an update on workflow, and we'll have other updates from subject codes, rights, and metadata later in this calendar year. The Supply Chain Committee itself evolved from what was the Manufacturing Committee up until the early part of the 2010s. It's currently chaired by Ken Brooks at Treadwell Media and Publishing Technology Partners. He's just succeeding the prior chair, Rebecca Burgoyne, who led the committee for the past 2 years. She's from United Methodist Publishing House. With 107 members, it's our 2nd largest committee. The largest is metadata, and its participants are drawn from across the supply chain. So we have within BISG 6 different segments that we both track and are required to be represented on our board of directors, and they're all evident. These include publishers, manufacturers, so paper and printing manufacturers, distributors, retailers, libraries, as well as industry partners that provide software and services for one or more of those segments. Each of our committees is governed by what we call a charter. The charter components are standard across the committees, and these charters are actually available on the BISG website under our committee tab. The charters consist of what are called current states. So what's going on in the industry? Why does this committee exist, and what problems is it trying to solve? Its overall objectives. These are typically multi-year and sustaining. Stakeholder benefits. What do you get out of the work that the committee creates? The deliverables. Those are typically for the current year. So you'll see those for 2021 in a moment for supply chain. And then what we call blockers. This is essentially things that might get in the way. It's a useful way for us to talk from committee to the board in particular to say, yeah, we don't have enough representation here. We need resources, et cetera. So that's part of the documentation as well. So I wanted to start by talking in these next two slides about the current state as the supply chain committee sees it. There are a lot of words here, but the core things that are drawn out are highlighted in bold and red. So we see things like remote work, significant shifts in supply chain capacity, and the need for essentially longer-term sustained trusted partnerships as all components of the environment in which the supply chain committee operates. As well, we think that particularly across the supply chain in total, there are problems with, we lack standards to handle information and inventory in a timely, cost-effective manner. You have here increasing conversations about direct-to-consumer fulfillment options, and that's a challenge, particularly for an industry on the trade side that has worked through retailing. And we're also looking at things like gray market and counterfeit sellers and the impact of piracy. Taken together, all of these things are not well understood, and we spend a fair amount of our time both documenting the problems and providing both data and strategy to help our members and the industry as a whole address them effectively. On the objective side, these are the longer term sustaining things. The first piece of the puzzle is to increase awareness about what's actually going on in the industry, conducting research, providing communications. This webinar is an example, and taking other actions, updating best practices guide and the like. Second piece is to try and explore how developing more trust-based relationships. So essentially, rather than looking simply at a vendor, but to say, this is a partner in my business, how can we share in what would be in some cases considered either confidential or proprietary information, so that each side of the equation knows what's going on and can plan more effectively. This is particularly important if you think about printing right now. The importance of being able to share information about when a book is going to be ready, what the quantities that you're seeing in the marketplace for orders, and then how that affects your press run. These are all critical pieces of the puzzle for helping your printer and in some cases paper manufacturers plan effectively. The third piece is to promote the value of prevailing standards and best practices. We've created several of them in the area of supply chain over the last, well, we've been around for 40, this is our 45th year, but the work there has been done largely in the 90s and 2000s, so the last 20 to 30 years. And we both have to update those, but also give people clear instructions on why they're important and how they can use them. And then the last piece is to update or implement those standards and best practices that are valued in multiple parts of the supply chain. And we'll talk a little bit about two documents that we're actually doing that on for 2021. The benefits of doing this work writ largely are that the standards that are used across the supply chain, when they're implemented consistently, improve both the efficiency and transparency in reporting. That's critically important because the transparency underpins the ability of the industry to track what's going on both within and across channels. A second piece is that if the more that people understand about how the supply chain works, as well as the impact of changes that might be made, whether it's essentially offering more non-book product or third-party sales and the impact of piracy, the more that people understand it, the more they can focus on opportunities and not the problem solving around just trying to understand what's actually going on. And then the third piece is we try to talk about trends so that the community is aware, the industry is aware, and it provides a foundation for coordinated change. And there are a couple of areas, particularly with respect to supply chain communication, where that is a long-term, I think probably a 3 to 5 year effort on our part. So those are the kind of the broad-based long-term goals. We have 7 deliverables that we put on our charter for 2021, and we're at various stages on each of them. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, so I won't recite this list, but you can see here, it's a pretty broad set of things to work on. This I think is the most ambitious agenda of our committees. They all have pretty active charters and sets of things to work on, but 7 is a lot of goals to work on, particularly during a pandemic. So we'll take these one at a time. The first piece is piracy mapping. This is a working group within the supply chain committee. And what we did was put together a group of about a dozen people. We've collected both publisher and vendor experience in terms of where piracy occurs, how it's managed and tracked and the like. And we've mapped it using a committee tool, a supply chain map that was developed in early 2020. We also have plans to engage a cross-section of anti-piracy tools, vendors that provide either tools to make you aware when piracy occurs or to track it in other ways, and then to share that information with the industry. I'm going to give you just a picture of what that map looks like. So we looked at this. It's essentially the book supply chain and then what's happening with piracy. And we had 3 different categories. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to just walk you through the instance piece. So we looked at instance, meaning how does piracy actually occur? And then mitigation, what steps are various actors, particularly publishers, taking to address piracy, and what resources might be available for anyone interested in this topic to either learn more or take action. So I'll go through this first from the publisher side. A couple of instances of piracy that occur. There's unprotected files from publishers, as well as leaked galleys or ARCs, advanced reading copies. When you look at manufacturers, there's the possibility of leaked files as well and leaked copies, although manufacturers in general will explain the things that they've taken, the steps they've taken to minimize the chances of that happening. When you look at inventory, there's early release inventory and counterfeit returns or issues. Talking to channel partners, there's sometimes online sales of unauthorized copies. There are documented instances of fake files on eBay, Etsy, and Facebook, which are not typically seen as book selling platforms, but there's been reports of increasing distribution of or sale of digital copies and sometimes physical copies on that platform. And there's also some risk with respect to licensees who might be channel partners who are not respecting copyright in that regard. We looked at licensees and resellers in the B2B segment as potential sources of piracy. And then when we looked at consumers themselves, online sales of unauthorized copies, particularly for used books, and audiobooks are both potential resources. This is actually a working draft, so we have more work to do within the working group within the supply chain committee on this topic. But this is kind of the starting point for what we'll develop in a brief white paper, and then to provide both direction and some resources that people can use to assess their own position with respect to piracy. The second of the 7 deliverables is actually a working project to examine whether or not we need to put prices on printed books. This is an issue that actually dates back to before the pandemic. We fielded a survey and found that there was generally no consistent practice across the supply chain. There were some vendors there were some customers, retailers who required it, others did not. And some publishers were reporting that they didn't have any issues not printing prices on books, others that they had to either have the book stickered, which cost some money, or that they had their orders, the orders canceled. There is growing interest among publishers in the survey that we conducted for options that would allow price flexibility. This is relatively simple to do online, but hard to do in bricks and mortar retail. And because retailer requirements are mixed, this kind of creates a bit of friction with respect to what publishers can do or reliably plan to do. After we did this study, we heard from some publishers who were testing alternatives, essentially taking the price off of the barcode and seeing how that works. Others are continuing to have an extended barcode that has the price section, but they're using a non-price identifier. We think this is a good opportunity to convene publishers and retailers to discuss. It probably will not happen in the fourth quarter because of the nature of how demanding bookselling is at this time of year, but it's still on our radar and we expect to continue this discussion. As I switch, I also want to encourage you, if you have questions, to use the Q&A box. You can also use the chat, but it's a little bit easier to check on the Q&A and the way it works within Zoom's webinar format. So if you have anything that goes on, Jonathan Fiedler, our operations manager, has joined me today, and we'll be both tracking the questions and posing them when we get to the toward the end of this presentation. So the third area is we're actually working on updating some best practices guide. These best practices guides span virtually all of our committees. There's lots of different topics that we do over the course of the last 25 years. But in the supply chain committee, we're specifically looking at container labeling and pallet headers. I know you're probably leaping to the BISG website to get a copy because it is exciting stuff. But relatively little has actually changed since the original guides were published, but we will be publishing some minor updates in a couple of areas, and those will probably be published this fall. The thing about some of these documents, while they don't naturally just jump to the fore of what you were thinking about is for BISG, are critically important because where you put a label on a box, as a simple example, and what information is on that label governs the extent to which it can be made retrievable in an automated factory. If the labels are not in the right place and if they're not readable by a machine, then a lot of other things become complicated. And when you think about the number of books, we generally have about 2.5 million books. I'm sorry, billion rather, units that we distribute in the course of a year in the US market. If there's 25 copies in a box, and for many books, that would probably be a high number. That means you've got 100 million containers produced this year of new books. So making sure that they can be both shipped and retrieved in a consistent way is an important business. We're also working on sales and inventory reporting. There's an immediate need, and we've created a working group around it, which is to establish best practice for reporting digital sales. There's a format that BISG developed in the early to mid 2000s that has been widely used and is fairly standard for reporting of physical sales, but business models have evolved significantly, particularly for digital. There are a lot of different ways to both sell and report on sales for digital products. And the Excel-based approach that is in place right now needs to at least be standardized. There's also a broader opportunity to look at creating or using a different standard rather than the current X12 one that would support two-way messaging. It's already in place for things like Onyx acknowledgement, so it's possible to send Onyx to a recipient and have them respond directly, acknowledging that it's actually been received, as well as you can use it to communicate receipt and error messages. There's potentially support for real-time messaging on things like inventory. That would be really interesting for a variety of folks, and it also because editext has increasingly been updated by Editor in the UK to have its code lists shared with the code lists that are used for Onyx, then in effect, the business model, how you describe how you're selling something on Onyx would then be, you could use editext to report that in the same way. And we think that would cut down on a lot of labor. That's not a working group effort. That's a much larger conversation that needs to be had. And we view that as part of that longer term supply chain planning effort. You may have heard of the work that we're doing. We had a webinar mid-year about it on the Industry Returns Initiative. BIC, which is the Book Industry Communications, it's our UK counterpart. We have very much the same remit in the US that BIC does in the UK. Has been doing work on creating industry returns guidelines since the late 1990s. That was a rule set for managing returns that was agreed upon by both publishers and distributors and retailers. Essentially, the rules about when you could return, how it would be communicated, what information you needed to be provided, and the like. There were no such standards widely implemented in the US market. And so we contracted with Information Media Partners, which is led by Michael Cairns, to conduct an initial study this spring and summer, actually. And he did a July webinar reporting on both the potential and the next steps on that. That webinar has been archived and can be viewed. If you go to the BISG website under events, there's a watch past webinars and you'll see it there. We are looking to create and fund a larger project in 2022. The funding is important in part because it needs to be done with data and in a fair amount of time. It's hard to put that kind of work into the committee as a whole, which is staffed by volunteers. But the other thing is we want to see if there's support for actually doing this work. Creating standards that no one implements is not a particularly useful exercise, but we do think that there's an opportunity to both save money and reduce both waste and friction across the supply chain by essentially coming to an agreement on how returns should be managed. Coming out of conversation last year, we actually put retailing engagement as one of the priorities for 2021. We wanted to try and strengthen engagement with retailers and the organizations that support that represent them. So the American Booksellers Association, NACS, which is National Association of College Stores, ECPA's Evangelical Christian Publishers Association, AU Press's American University Press. I'm sorry, Association for University Presses. They've changed their name in the last couple of years, and PubWest. And we've talked to these organizations to get a sense of what supply chain issues they have, how we can be helpful, where there have been pain points, and in some cases information deficits. These have been good conversations in a lot of different ways, but they've highlighted some things. So, for example, we've done at least one, maybe two different discussions about direct-to-consumer fulfillment. And as you see, it's something that motivates this committee. But obviously, that creates challenges for positioning with American booksellers, NACS, and others who, when they think about it, are representing the role of retailers who would potentially be cut out of the conversation for direct-to-consumer sales. So trying to find a way to talk about those issues while also respecting that there are significant components within the supply chain that need to be both informed and considered is an ongoing part of our conversation with them. We also have tried to identify opportunities with them to address supply chain efficiency and effectiveness issues. There are a number of different things that each of these organizations has kind of brought to our attention, and those are feeding into what we plan to do both now and into 2022. All of the outreach that we did, that I'm describing, occurred in the first half, and we think communication needs to continue in that regard. One of the things that I've certainly learned in the 5 years I've been doing this work with BISG is that there's no one and done, that everything is a regular set of conversations. One of the reasons our committees, all of them, meet monthly and regularly in that regard, is that each of these conversations, particularly when you're cutting across multiple different types of businesses. So publishers trying to talk to distributors, you've got both education and continued discussion is really required before you can get to a full understanding. And I think this last piece on partner relationships also grew out of a conversation that occurred particularly after the pandemic took hold in the second half of 2020. Just the generalized sense that industry relationships to be successful have to move from vendors. I'm going to go out and source something. I need to get printing. I need to get paper. I'm going to pick a distributor, to much more a sense of partnership where you're sharing information and goals and plans and actually trying to have a much deeper level of collaboration across the supply chain. But there are open questions both about how to get there and how to stay there. That best practice really hasn't been documented. The importance of partnerships is particularly grown when it comes to things like manufacturing, distribution, and retailing, but there's not that active level of communication, perhaps with printers, because there was an emergent need, particularly in the second half of 2018, and that shortage of printing capacity has continued till today. But we haven't thought about it as much with distribution or retailing, and yet those are critically important to actually getting all the way through to the consumer. So a little bit like the prior area, this is an area of continued development, and we'll keep working on it. But it's kind of developing best practice as we go. We have a set of things. I don't know that all of these things are feasible in 2022, but this is kind of what the early drawing board looks like. The asterisk here is that we kind of loosely group them as communications, forecasting, or inventory management, but maybe there's a better way to describe it. But some of the things that are on our radar are best practices for contingency planning. If you're following supply chain closely, or even generally, there are freight and shipping challenges, both getting into the US market as well as getting books moved and lots of other different types of things moved around the US. So how do we plan for that? How do we manage it? And what kind of impact does it have on lead times? Those kinds of questions. Working on operational information sharing. What are the limits of it? How feasible is it? How can we create those partnership bases, the bases for partnerships between companies in different parts of the industry? What's an effective way to prepare for direct to consumer and e-commerce? How do you balance it? How do you respect your existing channel partners and the role that they play for you, and support them at the same time that you're also developing those? Discussions of sustainability are important. The BISG itself, and we spent a little bit of time at our annual meeting in April, is now linked to both BookNet Canada and BIC in the UK to create a Green Book Alliance that is working to both conduct research and share information around sustainability. But I think there's a role for the committee to play, and we're trying to think that through. There's ongoing conversation about technology risks and the impact of hacking and IT vulnerabilities. There aren't a lot of good publishing examples, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about it. Certainly, we're a little bit less vulnerable in the trade space because we don't have as many direct customer relationships, but thinking about it more broadly, and also thinking about what happens if the retail partners that we do work with are compromised in some way. What's an effective way to respond? I talked a bit about editext before, but the notion of supply chain communication and providing more real-time or near real-time information could be really advantageous, particularly when you're thinking about the first bullet for contingency planning and the second in terms of information sharing. Within that, forecasting and inventory management kind of falls out of that. You don't have to necessarily implement a different approach to supply chain communication, something like editext, to get better forecasting and inventory management, but that would certainly be a component. And we are continuing to think about returns management. You know, we have that project in supply chain, but we don't have as much expertise there as we would like. And so building or changing the way that the committee works is an important piece of the puzzle. So that's kind of what we're working on, both the 7 goals as well as potentially 8 other topics that we'll be looking at for 2022. The work matters because it provides access to best practice and alternative resources. It's often the case that the largest publishers can kind of do this on their own, but not entirely, and not everybody has figured it out. These generally aren't areas in which publishers or any part of the supply chain competes with one another, but rather it's an opportunity for us to make the industry function better and grow. It gives us an opportunity to close information gaps and increase awareness of the tools and how they might be used. And then ultimately, if we're lowering costs, improving product quality and functionality, or improving time to market, then those are all benefits for book publishing as a whole, not for any one company. A lot of things have already happened this year. We held a virtual meeting of recipients, not just metadata, but for folks working in distribution and retailing in February to talk about a collection of 6 or 7 different issues. We've conducted the outreach to retailing and other organizations that I described earlier today. The updates for container labeling and pallet headers are in work. The supply chain map for piracy has been drafted, and we have some more work to do in terms of turning that into an accessible set of recommendations. And then we've evaluated the application of BIC's industry returns initiative, the rule set to the US market. So all good things, I think, that have kind of opened the door to further work this year and into next. I mentioned in describing the charters that each of them contains blockers, meaning that what things might get in our way. Within the supply chain committee, essentially, to be successful, all the segments have to be represented adequately, and that's a significant issue for us. If we don't have that representation, and it's probably strongest among publishers and retailers, and less in manufacturing, distribution, or third-party sales, then it's hard to solve the problem because you don't have all the right people at the table. The other thing that plays a role, and this is probably easily repeatable in almost anybody's operation, but for us in our committee structure, remote work requirements have really affected just normal communication channels between publishers and supply chain partners. Research takes a lot more time. Finding the right person takes a lot more time. We found this when we did the research into returns in the spring and summer. Just getting the right person on the phone or into a Zoom conversation was somewhat much harder than it's been in the past. If any of this work interests you, and I hope it does, you can get involved by participation in our committees and working groups is open to all BISG members. The meeting dates are always available on the events tab, but you can sort by committee meetings. The next meeting of the supply chain committee is actually a week later than our normal cycle because we had scheduled it for October 26th at a time when we thought the Frankfurt Book Fair would be a much bigger deal. But as it turns out, we're not going to Frankfurt this year. But the meetings kind of stays on the schedule we have. So October 26th to 10 a.m. Normally it's the third the third Tuesday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern. Participation right now is taking place online. All of our in-person meetings are on hold during the pandemic, although I hope to have at least one in-person meeting in April next year, which is our annual. But online for committees is always offered. So even if we return to periodic in-person meetings, there'll be some way to loop in for Zoom. And if you're interested in being added to the list of notices for the meeting, just contact the BISG office. We'll have that's the details on that in a moment. So I'll pause and turn to Jonathan and see if we have questions that I might be able to answer.
Once again, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Brian, someone is just asking, a little bit about participating, in the committee, and if they have ideas on issues that they think the committee should address. How much input do they have in terms of driving the work of the committee?
Well, the work of committees is done by the folks who show up. So the most important thing to do is to be part of the committee meeting. One of our committees, the BISAC, the Subject Codes Committee, has a form that anyone can fill out. So you need not even be a member, and you can make suggestions to the BISAC committee, but that's really specific to the way they work. So that those suggestions are reviewed at each meeting and either implemented or in some cases put aside, or perhaps it's already been addressed and somebody just missed it. So we don't have a form like that for any of our other committees. It's probably worth thinking about. But the most important recommendation I'd give is to come to the committee. And if you have a problem, outline the problem. As Jonathan will say to you, because he puts together the agendas for each of the meeting, if you really have something that you want to make sure there's time to talk about, and you can do it under new business, but often that's toward the end of the meeting and you might need to come back to it. But highlighting it to us and making sure that we can get it on the agenda would be a good way to go.
I think someone else here might have seen the article that you were interviewed for about prices on books earlier in the year, and wanted to know if there's anything more to say about that topic, and if it's just something we're going to pick up in the future.
Yeah, so prices on books dates back to the implementation of ISBN 13, in which went live at the beginning of 2007, but a lot of that work had been done 2 to 3 years before. There was an agreement made that with the move to ISBN 13, that the standard would include a price extension. And that was really important to at least a couple of the major retailers that were participating in the planning at that time. It was helpful for them for managing their inventory and comporting with how other products that they sold and represented were tracked. The question becomes now, if 2005 was when that planning was done, it's 15 to 16 years later. Does that requirement still hold? And I think what we need to do is have direct conversations with people who, first you have to find the right person in each retailing operation who can answer that question. A lot of the people who worked on, I would say virtually everybody who worked on the ISBN 13 project in 2005 is either retired or moved on to other jobs. So we have to reinvent that. That's kind of that getting the right people at the table conversation, and then understand things from their perspective. It's not simply enough to say this is inconvenient to publishers, we want you to go away. We have to look at what the impact would be in the retailing or distribution environment and figure that out. So that's going to be tough to do in the fourth quarter. This is an all hands on deck time for book publishing. That would be true in any year. It's particularly true with the potential shortages that people have been both reporting and writing about. But we're not going to let it go. There is strong interest, and as I said, there are publishers out there test driving potential solutions. I'd like to come up with a more uniform way to handle it than just having individual publishers negotiating their own deals.
We also have someone asking, you spoke a little bit about the returns initiative that we're currently studying, but what's going on right now within the pandemic with returns and
well, returns are anecdotally, because we don't have consistent reporting in this, and that's one of the areas I'd love to be able to tackle. But before we get to consistent reporting, just a rule set would be useful. But one of the things is we've heard that returns are down, in part because shipments to retail were down, but also shipments to bricks and mortar retail were down in the second half of 2020 because a lot of stores were closed. Some of the selling shifted online, which has historically had a lower returns level. As well, there was a shift in a lot of cases in the trade space to sales of backlist, which generally have fewer returns. They're pretty well known, and it's picking up on inventory that people have already printed. So the combination of those things seems to lowered the overall returns rate. However, we weren't really that interested in what the overall returns rate was. When we picked up our project, we were trying to say, how is it that what's the communication between a retailer and a publisher for books that a retailer wants to return? How much work is required on the part of the retailer? How much coordination is required at the level of the distributor or the publisher themselves if they're handling their own distribution? Where are there errors? What kinds of things could be better communicated? How much work is required to sort out problems when they occur? And I think what we heard from Michael Cairns' work is that those particular things, independent of the level of returns, are significantly that it adds up to a significant amount of labor, and that there's an opportunity for us to do better. So I think what we're going to do is I know what we're going to do, which is to approach publishers, distributors, and retailers, ask them to fund a targeted study to look at implementing some version of what BIC is already implemented in the UK, customized obviously to the requirements of the US market, to improve communications and lower costs associated with requesting and managing and processing returns.
We also have somebody who has done a little bit of their own personal looking up about editext and how it can integrate with Onyx code lists, but wanting to know a little bit more about the potential for editext for the U.S. market.
Well, it's a long-term potential, long-term being 3 to 5 years, and it will require us to really prioritize it as an opportunity. The potential is, for example, if you look at sales reporting, if you can describe, and people in Onyx do this now, if you can describe a sales model, subscription or lending to a library or trade sales at this discount, if you can describe it in Onyx, right now you can get it reported on using editext with the same level of detail coming back without manual intervention. I mean, that's a significant benefit. There are uses not just of editext, but of real-time reporting that would allow two-way communication of things like inventory or stock on hand and the like. But to make full use of that, right now those relationships are fundamentally worked out between a given publisher and a given distributor or retailer using often proprietary standards. I would be interested in trying to make it work for the industry as a whole, so that it's not just simply a capability that's available only to the largest or the most technologically sophisticated players, but to anyone who's publishing in the US market. That's kind of what BISG was formed to do, in part, which is to level the playing field and bring information to the industry so that we can grow as a whole. And that's one particular opportunity.
And one other question, there was some curiosity in terms of the focus on piracy and what's next with that project.
Well, initially there was the thinking within the working group was to look at the instance of piracy and the impact of piracy, to try and identify how much piracy was costing the book business. And that's a difficult question to answer. That's something I actually spent a lot of time on more than a decade ago when I worked as a consultant. And it's not an easy answer. And a lot of times when the answers are provided, they can, whether they're misleading or sensational, they don't really help change what you would do about it. So rather than focus on impact, we've looked at instance, and what we're trying to do is say, how do you know it's occurring? And what tools can you use to be better informed? And then what steps can you take either to reduce the instance of piracy or to protect yourself against instances in which piracy occurs? So we're trying to be really practical about that. I think the next steps will be to take the information that's summarized at a pretty high level on that single page diagram that I shared briefly and turn it into a white paper or research report with links to the appropriate resources for anyone interested in the topic in book publishing.
Very good. I was just giving the audience one more chance to ask any questions that they have, but
Okay.
I'm not sure if we have any more. We'll give it another maybe 30 seconds to a minute if anyone out there wants to ask anything.
Great. And while we're waiting, I can just touch base on a couple of things. We're working on a lot of different things at the Book Industry Study Group. We have more than 24 webinars that were planned for the year. We've also added a few during the course of the year, so it's probably closer to 30 by the time we get to the end of December. We had 2 virtual events, the annual meeting in April, and we're planning an annual rights program. It had been scheduled for late September, but we had a lot going on and we weren't seeing the registrations that we'd hoped for. So we pushed it back to November, but do look for that. We'll get a date to you shortly. I talked about the recipient summit discussion on February 4th. We've also launched 3 coffee break webinar series with 4 or 5 sessions outlined in the areas of rights, metadata, and workflow, respectively. So a total, I think, of 13 different sessions between now and early next year. And we're also having a discussion of a brown bag lunch series for supply chain issues that would operate differently from what we've been doing with coffee break. So we would get together at, for example, noon Eastern time, and it would be open to anyone who wanted to join. We'd present on a specific topic, perhaps for 20 minutes, take some questions on it, but then stick around and have an open forum where people could just share information, ask questions, identify problems, but kind of have a brainstorming session for the balance of it. We haven't finalized that yet. We expect to in the next few weeks, and look for an announcement there. We're also doing about a half dozen product updates throughout the year. The upcoming calendar is, this is actually just through the middle of October. So we have today's update. We're doing a coffee break webinar on rights in a couple of days. Next week, we'll have a metadata 102 focus on Onyx on October 13th, and a sponsored session on strengthening the publisher to author relationship through a royalty statement portal that's sponsored by Fidel. In 2 weeks, we have a session on reaching the incarcerated to look at opportunities to improve the availability and access that incarcerated individuals have to book content. It's a significant issue. That's going to be a good session. Julie Blackberg has helped us put that together with representatives from a variety of places, including Penn, which is very interested in this topic. And then the rights session, the program that I talked about that's been bumped, is a 2-hour session that we're planning for November. I mentioned before, if you're interested in joining a committee, there are a variety of different ways. If you write to me or to Jonathan, you can get to both of us simply by using info@bisg.org, info. The website has a lot of different resources. If you go to events and resources as opportunities, you can get a really good sense. There's also a search bar that gets you to publications really quickly, and you can call us. So,
Ryan, we do have a question that's come in on open access books, and are they gaining traffic, and will there be a unique supply chain or a unique supply chain challenge?
Not by coincidence, but BISG is part of an open access ebook analytics initiative that was it's funded by a grant from the Mellon Foundation. We were part of an initial 1-year planning grant, and then we're now in the middle of, we're actually in the second year of a 2-year development grant, and we expect that it will continue. We did work, and I saw that the question came from Edson, and I'd be happy to make this available. It's a publicly available report. We actually mapped the supply chain for open access books. It is different, and it's different for a variety of reasons that probably are not more extensive than we can go into here. But one of the things that starts is that the current supply chains are built on a model where there's a price for a book. And so, distributors in particular are paid as either a share or a per unit cost of the book. And retailers obviously get a discount, et cetera. There's none of that in place. So the way that the supply chain works for open access is both different and in some cases not fully formed. So we actually commissioned, it was a report done by Clark and Esposito, Michael Clark and Laura Ricci were the principals on it. Did a document, it's about a 45 or 50-page document outlining the supply chain and issues within the supply chain for open access works. That was we've made that document available, and if you have trouble finding it, let me know and we'll get you a copy.
Very good. And I think with that, we might be just out of audience questions.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks for managing those for us today. I want to encourage everybody to reach out to ask questions, and also if you're just interested in the work that this committee is doing, drop us a note. We'll get you added, and it's a little bit like drinking from a fire hose when you first go to a meeting, but all the committees are staffed by really friendly folks who laugh at themselves when they realize that they're talking in shorthand. Thank you for making the time to hear our update today. We look forward to seeing you at one of the events, whether later this week, next week, or sometime later this year.